Good evening, folks. I'm back for another one of these mission talkthroughs for the Phantom Pain. Now, I know we did up to mission 6 last time, and I kind of just briefly touched over what I think is kind of a big twist. I don't want to build it up too much because I'm not sure about the future of things, essentially. I don't know what plans Kojima has for the Roy Campbell character that I said was killed off essentially during this mutiny, and that's kind of speculation. I'm not 100% sure that's what happened because there is a version of it where we can rescue that Hamid survivor. So I know that was kind of a dark episode, but hopefully this one we'll talk about missions 7, 8, and 9. 7 and 9 will be a little shorter. 8 we're going to spend a lot of time on. I know. You're probably thinking like, what's this guy have to say about occupation forces? It's a really short mission. It's like it's a nothing mission, right? Anyways, before we get started though, I want to do a little addendum to the previous 2 videos I just released. Just going back into a couple things I went into in those videos. I wanted to sort of just as I rewatched them, I realized I didn't make some stuff clear enough. I'm using sort of like devices to think of stuff in a certain way, like symbolism, and speaking of it as if it's literal. So like when I was saying how Snake would fly away from the base, and then it would do a whole transformer thing, and then fly back, I was trying to say it was as if that was what was happening. I want to make this note about, since this is in VR, there's like crazy stuff that's implied to be happening, essentially. But what I think is really happening in the real event that we are it's depicted as happening in Afghanistan, which I think happened in '86 to into the '90s, that's actually happening between an offshore base, and then Afghanistan is the land base. It's just the land base in Afghanistan symbolically recreates the offshore base and a part of Camp Omega in 2 different time frames. I'll get to the time frames thing later. Excuse me. That's the literal truth. But the symbolic truth for the VR is kind of almost a literal truth as well. And that's why I'm wanting people to think about it that way, because that's how you thinking about these things in like a different way, that seeing as the parasites are artifice themselves and they can do crazy stuff, if you could just imagine wherever you have like a gap in like, how does this really work? Just be like, well, the parasites are doing something crazy. Just imagine something from popular media or something that could kind of fill in the gap and just kind of work from there. That's literally been most of my process, is just I'll see a reference and I'm like, hey, wait, maybe Kojima thought of it this way. And then you kind of get to applying this stuff back to Metal Gear and you're like, oh, this guy really did just rip off a bunch of different artists, didn't he? So, yeah, so all that's just, I wanted to say that about the land base and the sea base and all that. And also I wanted to note that there's a difference in the base shapes that you'll find in the Phantom Pain. The way Diamond Dog's base is depicted, it's hexagonal essentially, and there's hexagonal shells in Peace Walker's base, but it's got a totally different layout and different buildings and different sectors and stuff like that. And that's why I think that the Peace Walker offshore base that we build is really more representative of what the land base probably looked like already, or was planned to have looked like. And they just turned this one into like a copy of it back in the MSF days. So I think that one's destroyed and it's rebuilt as the hexagonal one. And we get that kind of confirmed that the hexagonal stuff is maybe kind of another one of those VR hallucinations, because Metal Gear Solid 2. We know Metal Gear Solid 2 is probably mostly VR as we experience it. And those big shell struts, which they're probably real and probably were constructed in reality, but since we know this is all constructed for the purposes of essentially a VR exercise built like it's a VR exercise in reality, the idea of them being hexagonally oriented and having like the one shell here and the other shell here like it is in Metal Gear Solid 2, that might be kind of similar to what's really going on in the Phantom Pain, as we're seeing like sort of an AI-made version of what's really there. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that our base in Diamond Dogs might actually be bigger than what we can actually see. And since Venom's so, controlled by all this hypnagogia and hallucinations and stuff, we might literally have an airport attached to our Diamond Dog's mother base out at sea where jets can take off from and land at, but we're just not allowed to see it, and we're not allowed to go there. But I'll get to it later. Africa has a structure that kind of stands in for an airport, and there's kind of an implication that we pick up us, Venom Snake, who's really, I'll get to delineating Venom Snake from who else he stands in for later, because that's just a whole deal. I don't want to get into it now. But anyways, that's... oh, yeah, and the other thing I wanted to mention was I went into the Ground Zero side ops briefly and then kind of like wandered off. I wanted to touch back on it. I said there's 5 Ground Zero side ops. There's not. There's 4 Ground Zero side ops, and then there's the main op. So there's 5 ops that make up the Ground Zeroes sort of like whole scenario. There's also Jamais Vu and Deja Vu, but we're going to leave those out. There's Eliminate the Renegade Threat, which we're going to get back to in Mission 7. The C.I.A. one, classified intel acquisition, the anti-air one, which I talked about last time, and the intel agent rescue, which I talked about the first time. I also wanted to go back and mention the anti-air radar stuff that I talked about in C2W. I just kind of said, like, oh, yeah, we do the anti-air radar stuff in C2W. It's not really part of the mission tasks, I don't think. It may be. But anyways, C2W, your first time playing through the game, is usually your first opportunity to, like, observe where the anti-air radar is and get a good chance to destroy it, because usually the previous 2 missions, the anti-air radar is located somewhere else, and usually the game doesn't prompt you about destroying it. You have to like look at it and then call in and ask about it, and they'll tell you that it's the anti-air radar, and if you destroy it, it'll allow your helicopters to get in close. And usually for me, that's how it was. The first time I did that was in C2W, because the whole focus in that mission is all of a sudden now focused on to destroying the structures in this outpost. In the previous missions, you're focused on either killing a dude or rescuing a dude, and there's not really a whole lot of focus on, like, well, go find the anti-air radar and destroy it. Because, like, at those other locations, like I said, it's out of the way. Whereas in C2W, at the intel... the Eastern Comms Post, it's just right there in the middle. It's really easy to see. So, anyways, that was a lot. Excuse me. Now we can actually talk about the subject of this video. Missions 7, 8, and 9. So Mission 7 is Red Brass. It's a conversation between 3 base commanders in Afghanistan. This is the Eliminate the Renegade Threat side op that we do in Ground Zeroes, where we have to go get Glaz and Palitz. There's only 2 of them in that one, but it's essentially the same scenario. If you follow, I can't remember which one it is. You follow them around the. It's like they're like a sniper spotter pair, and it seems like they're experienced. And one of them's got kind of a funny feeling about what's going on, and the other one's been out on the base, kind of patrolling around. And then they finally meet, and they're like, I don't like this. We need to, like... I can't remember exactly what all they say in the conversation. I need to probably go back and acquaint myself with that material. But this meeting between Glaz and Palitz is exactly what's going on with the meeting between the 3 commanders. So essentially, it's like Snake's taken out some of the base commanders that were working for Big Boss in the previous missions. He took out the one at the combat platform. He took out another one... I can't remember where. No, I think he only took out the one. But then he took out the intel stuff, and then he's done his little Camp Omega intel gathering thing where he goes and shadows Kaz being tortured and does all that. And then he comes back to the offshore base, to the MSF platforms, and sees all these commanders for the different struts, I guess, that are working for Big Boss. They're all meeting together, and they're like, okay, we know that there's somebody working against us. Like, we're doing this mutiny, and we know we've got control, but they're still having resistance. So this is like related to, like, you could think of it like in the Shadow Moses operation, when the rebels have taken control of the base, and then Snake infiltrates, and he listens to one of the conversations from the ducks and hears that they've got problems. There's somebody loose on the base, and you think it's you, but then you hear that this guy's like killed a bunch of dudes already, and you're like, wait a minute, you may not have killed anybody yet, so you'll be like instantly cue you in that's not you that they're talking about. This is kind of the same thing. Like, you're quite literally still loose after their whole mutiny, and they think that they've pulled it off, but now they realize, okay, there's a fly in the ointment, so to speak, and so they're discussing what the heck to do about it. So we can relate this in a whole lot of ways, these meetings. Glaz and Palitz meet outside of the main guard tower. We know in Wialo village, when you came here during one of the earlier missions, you had to get intel where cause was being held. You go up into that sort of that tower, and you would think, if you were the commander of that base, that might be the safest place. But no, they go and they meet outside of the tower, across the street, in like just some other random building. The first time you play this mission, it's actually kind of tough to figure out where they're at. If you know where they're at, you can go straight to it, but presumably they're like meeting somewhere outside of the main area, so as to disguise where they're meeting, because they're doing some shady stuff. So the meeting outside of the tower also happens for Glaz and Palitz in Ground Zeroes. I think it's the sniper one, the black guy, is the one who's always up in the tower, and the white one is who's always going around. And I can't remember which one's which. I hate it. Anyways, so yeah, these are, like I said, these are like the platform commanders. And what are they saying they're going to do is they're going to set up mines in areas where they don't have enough personnel to cover all the areas. So mines actually is kind of a reference to Fox, because we know Gray Fox's thing is he dies to landmines a bunch. He gets blown up. And also the mines kind of have a double meaning that'll come up later when we get to Africa and we go to Kunganga mine, or as it's also called, I think, Shinkoloboy mine. Or maybe Shinkoloboy mine was another mine. I can't remember. But Ocelot talks about Shinkoloboy mine, and I think that's Kunganga mine, actually. Anyways, mines, yeah. So that's basically Red Brass. There's a little more to talk about there, but I'm going to move on, because Mission 8, Occupation Forces. This is a doozy, okay? So this one's a doozy because we're infiltrating C.I.A village. We've never been here in the campaign. And what does this stand for? It's not anything on the map. Well, this is a recreation of the admin sector of Camp Omega. It's kind of mirrored. You're like infiltrating it in a mirrored side, but like imagine going up the hill as you do after you exit the abandoned sector in Camp Omega. You hang a right, you go under that bridge, and you kind of go up a hill, and then you're in the admin sector. Well, this is that. and instead of having like all the doors and everything, it's just a big city on a hill, kind of, or a little town on the hill that's been converted into this this rebel base, essentially. But you can obviously tell that these Soviets don't live here. They've come and kicked out the people who lived here and turned it into a base. That's the important, I think, story point here. Excuse me. So, what are we doing in this mission? We're stopping the deployment of the Colonel and his armored column. Now, the basic script of it is that you go gather intel in the tower, and then vehicles start going. That tower relates back to the tower I was talking about at Ground Zeroes, the intel tower. So this tower, this building the house where the intel is at the very top of the whole hill, you could kind of equate that to that guard tower, that main central guard tower, kind of on the outside wall of the admin sector of Camp Omega, the one that's so hard to get to, that's got the spotlights on it, where one of the Glaz and Palitz pairs sitting, and you find 2 tapes up there in Ground Zeroes, which I'll get to here in a bit. But that whole script, we go to a tower, we find the intel, and then a bunch of vehicles take off. Does that sound familiar yet? That's exactly what we do later on in the game in Mission 30, in Skullface in that mission. When we infiltrate OKB-0, we go to the very back. We have to find some intel at the tower, and then after we find the intel, a bunch of vehicles take off. That's exactly what's going on here. So, also when you do this to Skullface, or when you do this in the Skullface mission, if you don't go all the way up to the platform first, you can kind of wander around the path back to where the elevator is going to be that Skullface is going to lead you back down to. You can go back to that area before the elevator's operational, and there's a boombox there with a tape that I think you're supposed to pick up for one of the mission tasks, and it's got a Peace Walker Heaven's Divide tape on, music on it. And that Peace Walker tape is like, the Heaven's Divide is referring to the mutiny and everything. So that tape also refers to the tape in this tower, well, the intel in this tower, I should say, and then the tape that we get in Ground Zeroes. There's actually 2 tapes that we get in Ground Zeroes in that tower. The tapes are Chico's tape number 2 and the Agent's recording, I believe. Yeah, that one's titled Agent's Recording. Now, I'll get back to those in here in a second. But first, let's talk about the Colonel. So I've said that we've equated Skullface with this Colonel, right? And he's kind of like the commander of, units out in the field. Now, who are the other Colonel characters that we know in Metal Gear? We know that Colonel Volgin was the first one, and I think you can kind of equate this armored column to Volgin's armored column at the end of Snake Eater. We also know there's Colonel Skoronsky, which he's kind of a nothing character, but I've speculated that he's probably kind of a stand-in for the Colonel Volgin role during the Portable Ops scenario. There's also Colonel Campbell. So this Colonel is probably, if I had to guess, the new Kazuhira Miller, the stand-in, essentially, who's out on the base, been replaced. He's replaced the old Roy Campbell, and now he's commanding their armored column. And their armored column on the base is probably like, his like protective detail. And we got to go get him because we know that the real Miller's probably, I'm guessing he's dead during this point. But since he's got the parasites in him, he might not be dead. I wanted to say that. He might be like dead but potentially revivable. I don't know. It's, parasites are nanomachines. It's weird. And this was back in the 70s, so not sure. We know Chico blew up and survived because of the stuff that was in him, but that was special stuff that was put into him. The Archaea and the Diamond. I'm not sure if Miller actually had like a diamond put into him. It might have been more like the way that the Skulls control the other units in this game with like some kind of just a general air dispersal thing that's like a pheromone or something that only works. It works on humans, but it's like a temporary thing and doesn't like fully convert them into the actual Skull units. But anyways, so these colonels all are kind of related together. But then there's these tapes. So there's the Peace Walker Heaven's Divide tape in Mission 30. There's no tape in this mission, I don't believe. Sakurai Village does have a tape, though, in the building right next to this one. If I'm remembering correctly, that's where you find the final countdown, which you can just go get it anytime once you've started the game and Sakurai Village is in your deployable zone, of whatever you're doing out in Afghanistan. You can just go get it as soon as the game starts. But this will be your first time to go get it. Of course, that song didn't come out till 1986. So to me, that means this mission in Afghanistan is probably happening in 1986. But it's referring to something that happened in 1975. Now, back in 75, you found those 2 tapes. Now, tape number 2, Chico's tape number 2, was recorded as we're told. Now, first of all, I want to say on the subject of these tapes in Ground Zeroes and all the tapes in the Phantom Pain, these are tapes. Tapes are editable. Somebody writes whatever they want on the label. You can't trust that information if you didn't put it there yourself. You know that, right? Okay, good. So we're not going to trust what these tapes tell us, but we're going to use it as like a basis because we know these tapes are all lies. They were used as like symbolic recreations of what had really happened. So we're told this is from March 9th to 11th. So there's a 9/11 reference right there. The March 9th date is a total lie. Like I said, I think this actually happened back in February, and we're told it's March because it's easier for them to cover their stories. And it's just a recording from Chico's cell. It's like a 2.5 minute long recording. And I wrote down a quick little thing of what all happens in it. Pause is taken. Then you hear there's like a hard cut. And then you hear some nature sounds. Then there's another hard cut. Then you hear Pause being tortured. Then there's a hard cut. Some static. Another hard cut. You hear this line then. I think Pause is brought back to her cell. Somebody says that she looks weak. And then Chico says that she's back early. And she's just like, Chico, can we not do this? Blah, blah, blah. And he doesn't get it. And that's basically it. Now, before I get into that, we need to talk about what's on the other tape that you can get in this same location at Ground Zeroes. It's the agent's recording. Now, the agent's recording is a longer, I think it's like 7.5 minute long tape, and it's just one man being tortured by Skullface with the voice of James Horan. So we know this is Fox recreating the torture of somebody that Big Boss tortured. Now, I'll get into it, but I'm pretty sure that this recreation is the recreation of the real Roy Campbell, Kazuhiro Miller. I think this guy in this tape with Skullface, well, what does he do? He doesn't do anything, actually. He doesn't say a word the whole time. And he's presumably like being waterboarded, but you can tell that he's given the opportunity to speak from, if you listen real close, the way the audio effects, it's awful, but you can tell like they probably are drowning him and then giving him a chance to speak, and he doesn't speak. So he's a mute. That relates him to the Hamid survivor who's a mute. That means this is probably Kaz. Now, realistically, I think that probably means that Big Boss cut out Kaz's tongue. And also, the state of Kaz in the Phantom Pain missing an arm and a leg probably also happened from Big Boss. I might as well get into it. Since I said these are all recontextualizations, the song Here's to You is also included as being one of these recontextualizations, which begs the question, what was the song that Big Boss used during the torture? And there's a film reference that everybody knows that will explain it perfectly. Reservoir Dogs. Stealers Wheel, Stuck in the Middle with You. Mr. Blonde tortures a cop and cuts his ear off, and it's a crazy scene. That's probably what's being referenced here with all of this stuff with Kaz being tortured and mutilated. And the Here's to You constantly playing. We know that these tapes, the torture we hear on these tapes is actually a recreation, which is crazy, but that probably just means that what was really going on that they're recreating was probably even worse. But I think that's why both of these tapes that we get in this same location deal with the torture, and it's found in the tower. And the torture and the tower relates to the Skullface mission because, I'll get to it later, that Chico was also tortured. And probably after his torture was brought back from where he was tortured to his cell. And that's exactly what Skullface does in the Skullface mission. We go there, we get the intel. So the going there and the getting of the intel is sort of analogous to being brought to this admin sector from your cell and then being tortured and then brought back to your cell. Like that's kind of what's going on here. Yeah, I need a sec after that. It's another heavy topic, and this is why so much of this stuff had to be spoken of symbolically and had to be redacted. I think is because it's dealing with topics that are quite literally taboo. I don't really want to get into it myself. You know, there's the whole trope of like, oh, she's not really as young as she looks, and she's older, blah blah blah, and it's just like. It's all just disgusting, you know? It's just all awful. So I don't want to get into it here and discuss. You can decide what to think of it yourself. This is just, to me, what the symbols say. This is what the symbolism of the narrative says. I'm not wanting to put any of this in there myself, trust me. But this is what I think the story was, is that Big Boss captured Paz after the whole Zeke incident, tortured her, she was probably raped, captured Chico after he tried to show up and rescue her, expecting that Chico was working with Zero. So then he tortures Chico and then probably forces Chico to torture Paz. But So, like I said, all the stuff we hear on the tape is recontextualization. So the forcing of Chico to torture Paz could be symbolism for being forced to torture himself. And maybe Chico actually wasn't fully really tortured in the way that we think and see it in Ground Zeroes. Maybe only Paz received the torture, and Chico just had to sit there and watch, maybe, and was only there in the cell and saw her brought back day after day. Maybe. What I'm saying is this story is, since it's all symbolic and I'm interpreting it, I urge you not to take it too literally, essentially. This is fiction, so this is not meant to be like some kind of a rub your face in the dirt kind of thing. This is just being like a sober appraisal of how war has literally gone on in the real world for centuries now. Some really awful things have happened in war, and we can't really show them in video games maybe, but we can symbolically speak of them through things like this. I think that's why that's here in Ground Zeroes and the Phantom Pain, and because it deals with Fox's his persona. It comes from trauma. He's born from betrayal and sort of just being caught in a bigger thing than he ever imagined he would be caught in. That's part of the whole deal. So, anyways, that's Mission 8, Occupation Forces. Yeah, you thought it was just go get a intel file and fault in some vehicles. No, there's a lot of heavy stuff. I'd urge you to go back and do the Glaz and Palitz mission, the Renegade threat, and just pay attention to what's going on. All the narratives that go on in Ground Zeroes around that guard tower. Because, like I said, the tower is kind of like a bridge. The tower comes back up as a symbol over and over again, and it's like a bridge. The Tower of Babylon was quite literally intended to be a tower for a way for humans to reach the heavens, a bridge to the heavens. And that's why it was smoked. So you see, the towers kind of relate to the mutiny thing, actually, because Babylon and America, and it all ties up. You'll see. So let's get over to Mission 9, Back Up, Back Down. This one's actually blessedly going to be short and easy. Mission 9 you can think of as like, okay, so imagine that this mutiny's happened. And now at this point, Snake's done a few of his sneaking peeks. He's taken out intel stuff. He's caused some problems. So these guys that are mutinying, they know that they've got an issue. They know that there's another side to this, that Zero's side is still out there somewhere. So Mission 9 kind of represents the eventual kind of coming to a head of those two sides in open conflict. Again, it's the Hamid rebels that we're supporting by taking out the Soviets' reinforcements. Now in Mission 9 and Back Up, Back Down, it's, if you're gonna do all the mission tasks, it's a bitch. It's awful. There's so many things all over the map that you have to do. It takes like 30 minutes, even if you're speed running it and you do it all well. Maybe you can do it in like 20-something minutes, I'm sure, but you've got to get 6 prisoners and 1 weapon. I'll get to what that is. You've got to stop all of the stuff, and you got to fight a helicopter, and I can't remember what all the other mission tasks are. They're not super important. Those are the big important ones, though. So what this stands for like I said, in the symbolism of the bigger story back in 75 is that this is probably where the conflict came to a head. And so Big Boss probably sent a bunch of his armored reinforcements to the offshore base. He's like, okay, we've lost comms and we know that we're getting screwed over. My cause just got picked up and now he's gone. So Big Boss is just throwing all of his crap at us. And Snake's ready for it, and he intercepts like everything, and it just basically becomes his stuff now. That's the whole game. That's what's happening. So like earlier I said that I think that Zero was his support, and he was doing it under Big Boss's nose back on the land base. But I also think what was really happening is Snake is like taking back parts of the offshore base piece by piece, and once he's taken back enough of that, it's like then they're really based off out of the offshore base. And so there's this conflict that's coming to a head between the offshore base and the land base stuff. So the land base is Outer Heaven, and the sea base, well, who are they? Are they really MSF anymore? No. I think this is where Diamond Dogs came from. I think Diamond Dogs, we know that, you can see right there, the dog there is actually a Rhodesian Ridgeback. And we know that Frank Hunter dealt with stuff in Rhodesia in the 70s after this conflict. The Rhodesian stuff, I can't remember what year it ended, but it ended pretty... God, I'm totally blanking on the years now, and I watched a whole documentary about it. Anyways, we know that Frank was involved in the Rhodesian conflict, in the whole Civil War there. So we know that his organization probably goes on to do that stuff, and so that's probably where the Diamond Dogs organization came from. They probably weren't named Diamond Dogs back in 75. It was maybe still named Outer Heaven, maybe still MSF, I don't know. But that was essentially what happened, was like this base that they thought they had destroyed out at sea comes back from the grave to get its vengeance. And that's where the story for the Phantom Pain comes from, and why we're doing it. So we're essentially chasing down phantoms here and back up, back down. 6 prisoners and 1 weapon, 6 plus 1, 7 total, is a number we'll see come up again in, I believe it's Close Contact, in one of the Africa missions. The 6 prisoners relate to the 6 child soldiers, the 6 Foxhound members. Now, they're not all really children, but like they're like the new generation. So that's why they're spoken of as children, as in like they're the next generation. As in Fox was the parent, and Foxhound is the child. Okay, so child just means like parent-child, doesn't mean like child doesn't necessarily mean juvenile. Gotcha. So Revolver Ocelot, we know, is Foxhound. Psychomantis is Foxhound. Tretage. Vulcan Raven. Sniper Wolf. Those 4 are all in the Phantom Pain. We've got Ocelot, Mantis is Tretage, Sniper Wolf is Quiet, Vulcan Raven is Code Talker. And then there's also, who are the other 2 members of Foxhound? Snake and Fox. Now, who's Snake? No, well, now we know at Shadow Moses it was Liquid Snake. But who's Snake here? That's a very good question, and I'll get back to it. Now, we know who Fox is. Fox is Chico. So we've got Chico accounted for. We've got Paws accounted for. We've got these other new people that he's... I don't know if he's actually made them yet, but this is like a stand-in for all of them. These might actually be the original Cypher members of Fox. And Snake is rescuing them from being captive. But they're like stand-ins for Foxhound. So who's this Snake, though? Well, I'll get to it, but it's kind of both Solidus and Vamp. Short answer. Okay, so anyways, moving on. The weapon itself stands for Metal Gear, actually. So like the big missile launcher that you get, that's literally one of Metal Gear's main weapons, the missiles that it launches out of the back. I'm talking specifically of Sahelanthropus and Rex, which are the 2 most relevant ones for this mission. So, and then finally, after you've stopped his whole offensive, stopping Skullface's offensive, that's what we've done here. That's kind of what happens in Mission 31 too. You know, it's kind of a repeat in the way that Mission 8 was a sort of a repeat of Mission 30. If you want to look at it that way, this is kind of a Mission 31 repeat. And after you stop all of the campaign and the timer quits, you get 3 tanks sent after you, and a Soviet gunship. So this is like your stand-in for the Hind D boss fight that happens in so many other Metal Gear games. So that's how it stands in for like the Sahelanthropus boss fight. But this isn't the real boss fight. This is like it's sort of like the first half of the game. So going back over everything, it's like we've had I said there are 4 side ops and then the main op. Well, it's like we did those side ops in missions 1, 3, 4, and 5, and then those are the 4 side ops. And then mission 6 was like the first half of the main op. And then mission 7, 8 and 9 are also kind of like more side ops, actually. Like we've replayed more side ops, and now we're ready to do the main op again. Although Mission 10 is kind of like a combination of a side op and the main op. And it really is just the main op, though. Because Mission 11, we'll get to it, stands for what happens after the main op. But that's missions 7, 8, and 9. Yeah. Hopefully I didn't miss anything that I was wanting to talk about. I know that maybe was kind of quick, but hopefully y'all appreciate the quicker explanations. I could be more long-winded, trust me, but I'll just chill for now. Yeah, that's everything. Cool. Y'all have a good night. Peace out.